Hello, this is Dr. Ominde. So we continue with the series on autonomic nervous system. So next we are to discuss the pre-vertebral autonomic plexuses. Now the sympathetic trunk we said runs parallel to the vertebra, but we also have direct visceral branches of the sympathetic trunk, and these run towards the pre-vertebral plexuses. And these lie near the midline in front of the vertebral column, and thus the name pre-vertebral autonomic plexuses. So these plexuses actually contain both sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers, and usually include both pre-ganglionic and post-ganglionic fibers, and they have visceral afferent fibers and some cell bodies of postganglionic neurons. So the prevertebral autonomic plexuses contain visceral fibers carrying sympathetic or parasympathetic information. So then we have major prevertebral plexuses in the body. So within the thorax, we have cardiac and pulmonary prevertebral plexuses. Then in the abdomen, you have the celiac plexus around the celiac trunk, and in the pelvis, we have the hypogastric plexuses. So then we discuss the enteric nervous system. This comprises the plexuses within the wall of the gastrointestinal tract. And we have the myenteric plexus, also called Auerbach's plexus, within the muscle layer. And we have the Meissner's plexus within the submucosa of the GI wall, so they're also called the submucosal plexuses. So enteric nervous system is commonly recognized as a subdivision of the autonomic nervous system, and this is because it also contains pre- and postganglionic sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, as well as interneurons and general visceral afferents. It also has extensive interconnections between the neurons, and when isolated from the central nervous system, the enteric nervous system usually can continue to function, whereby it's able to control peristalsis and secretions from the glands of the gastrointestinal tract, and also modulate its blood flow without direct input from the central nervous system. So it can function independently. Then the network of the ganglionic plexuses in the enteric nervous system are usually isolated from the surrounding intercellular fluid in the same manner as the brain is isolated within the blood-brain barrier. So the control of the enteric nervous system, as we have said, it can operate independently, and different signals usually come from both sympathetic and parasympathetic systems, and these are able to drive the enteric nervous system. So these different signals are modulated within the enteric nervous system than in other peripheral ganglionic plexuses of the autonomic nervous system. So parasympathetic effects to the enteric nervous system will aid in food passage and digestion. So parasympathetic stimulation will cause vasodilatation, increased peristalsis, and increased secretion by the GI glands, while sympathetic will cause the opposite of this. So there will be vasoconstriction of the vessels to the GI, therefore reducing the blood supply to the GIT. Then there is also inhibition of peristalsis and contraction of involuntary gastrointestinal sphincters. So generally, what are the comparisons between the sympathetic and parasympathetic system? Now, remember we said sympathetic, the preganglionic outflow is from the thoracolumbar region of the spinal cord, T1 to L2, while parasympathetic is craniosacral, involving cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, 10, and sacral portion S2 to S4. Then, the cell bodies of postganglionic parasympathetic neurons usually are more peripherally located. Remember, the sympathetic nerves, they synapse at the sympathetic trunk that is parallel to the vertebral column. However, for parasympathetic, the ganglia are close to the target organ. Therefore, the cell bodies of postganglionic neurons are situated more peripherally. Then acetylcholine is involved in both pre- and postganglionic neurons in both sympathetic and parasympathetic. But acetylcholine is specifically released at parasympathetic neuroeffector junctions. So that's where you find cholinergic nerves, while noradrenaline is released at sympathetic neuroeffector junctions, and those are adrenergic nerves. However, there's an exception. Only postganglionic sympathetic nerves to sweat glands are cholinergic. So if you're to look at we have preganglionic and postganglionic fibers. So acetylcholine is involved in both preganglionic and postganglionic fibers. And at the neuroeffector junction, you have acetylcholine as the main parasympathetic neuroeffector, while the noradrenaline is a sympathetic neuroeffector. Noradrenaline is a sympathetic neuroeffector, except only postganglionic sympathetic nerves to the sweat glands, which are usually cholinergic. So both pre- and post-ganglionic in parasympathetic use acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter, but in post-ganglionic sympathetic, we have also the use of acetylcholine. Otherwise, in sympathetic, noradrenaline is the main neurotransmitter. So this just shows you the differences between somatic and autonomic nervous system. And within the autonomic nervous system, you're able to see the differences between sympathetic and parasympathetic system. So within the somatic nervous system, there's no involvement of the ganglia, and the nerves innervate the skeletal muscle. So there's a neuromotor junctions where there's release of acetylcholine. Now, when you come to the autonomic nervous system, specifically the sympathetic nervous system, there is release of acetylcholine by the preganglionic fibers, okay, whether at the ganglion or at the level of the adrenal medulla. So acetylcholine will be released. Then what happens? The postganglionic fiber will now release norepinephrine to cause an effect on the target organ. And in the case of the adrenal medulla, it produces, the chromaffin cells also produce norepinephrine that cause effects on the target organs. Now, on the other hand, parasympathetic, the preganglionic fibers release acetylcholine, and the postganglionic fibers also release acetylcholine at the target organs. Now, if you're to look at the position of the ganglion in parasympathetic, it's close to the target organ compared to the position of the ganglion in sympathetic. So the sympathetic ganglia within the sympathetic trunk, the ganglia in parasympathetic are close to the target organ. And then another difference, if you're to look at the preganglionic fiber in sympathetic, it's shorter than the preganglionic fiber in parasympathetic, because this fiber has to be long to get to the ganglion that is close to the target organ. However, the postganglionic fibers in sympathetic system are longer than those of parasympathetic. Then sympathetic system is widely distributed, especially to the smooth muscle cells of the blood vessels in the whole body, while parasympathetic is strictly visceral and does not innervate any structures in the body wall and the limbs. Okay, so parasympathetic is visceral, while sympathetic is widely distributed. Then there's usually a balanced antagonism between the two systems, sympathetic and parasympathetic, so that you are able to maintain some level of homeostasis. So, for example, stimulation is going to cause dilatation of the bronchi, while parasympathetic will cause constriction of the bronchi. Then sympathetic system is associated with acceleration of the heartbeat, while parasympathetic system causes bradycardia or slow heart rate. So this just shows you the differences. In sympathetic is where you have the fight-flight mode. Yeah, I like telling students to assume that in sympathetic system is like you're in a room and a lion suddenly comes in. So how will your body react because of that fear? Okay, while parasympathetic is what your body is doing while you're seated, probably in class in a calm situation. So in sympathetic, there is dilatation of the pupil of the eye so that you bring in more light. Parasympathetic, there is constriction of the pupil. Sympathetic has inhibition of glands, so salivary glands, GI glands, while in parasympathetic, these glands are stimulated to secrete. In sympathetic, the bronchi are relaxed, so they dilate, the bronchi dilate because the muscles are relaxed so that you bring in more oxygen, but there is constriction in parasympathetic. The heart rate, of course, goes high up in sympathetic and it's slowed in parasympathetic. The GI activity, secretions, and peristalsis are inhibited in sympathetic, while in parasympathetic, the GI is functioning. Secretions are happening from the glands such as the pancreas, the gallbladder is stimulated, the stomach and the intestines are having a good peristaltic movement. Sympathetic stimulates adrenal medulla to produce norepinephrine. There is inhibition of the bladder emptying in sympathetic, while the bladder emptying is promoted in parasympathetic. Then parasympathetic is also associated with erection of the genitals, while sympathetic promotes ejaculation and vaginal contractions. So this table also just gives you the differences between sympathetic and parasympathetic, which we have already discussed. Remember, in parasympathetic, usually the GI sphincters are relaxed most of the time, while in sympathetic, there is increased tone in the sphincters. So the other difference between sympathetic and parasympathetic is that the functional effects of parasympathetic are more localized, while those of sympathetic are generalized, because remember we said sympathetic is widely distributed. So the preganglionic parasympathetic fibers, they usually terminate on few postganglionic fibers than do their sympathetic counterparts. Remember, sympathetic is more generalized with a wider distribution. So the ratio of preganglionic to postganglionic cell bodies in parasympathetic is 1:2. So parasympathetic terminates on few postganglionic. So a preganglionic will release its neurotransmitter on only a few postganglionic neurons, while in sympathetics, like in superior cervical ganglia, one sympathetic preganglionic relays onto 32 postganglionic neurons. So the effects are more generalized. Again, the generalized sympathetic activity is reinforced by the release of adrenaline into the circulation from the adrenal medulla. Remember, adrenal medulla is an endocrine gland. It releases its secretions into the blood, and this again generalizes the effects of sympathetic activity because norepinephrine is the hormone that's responsible for sympathetic response. So these chromaffin cells of the adrenal medulla are innervated directly by preganglionic sympathetic neurons. So this just shows you some of the differences. Sympathetic is thoracolumbar, parasympathetic we said is craniosacral. Then preganglionic come from T1 to L2 in sympathetic, while in parasympathetic from some cranial nerves and S2, S4 portions. Then the ganglia in sympathetic are near the spinal cord and they usually release acetylcholine, while the ganglia in parasympathetic are near the target organ and the preganglionic fibers also release acetylcholine. Now, then postganglionic fibers, most postganglionic fibers in sympathetic release norepinephrine, while in parasympathetic they release acetylcholine. And remember, sympathetic is a fight-fright response, while parasympathetic is the response at rest. So next video we will discuss how the autonomic nervous system is regulated.